Good evening, everybody. Hello, Mr. Young. Welcome. Nice to see you. Thank you for coming to our EIU roundtable at the Central Asia Trade Forum. Thank you to the organizers for letting us do this during the Forum Week, this very important report to present to you and discuss it. We also like to thank the Central Asian governments and representatives that are participating in our trade forum and today's roundtable. I just wanted to start with some housekeeping tips. This event is being recorded. You will be able to view it after the end of each day on the forum website or YouTube channel in Russian and English. All participants are muted to avoid disruptions. Please ask your questions in the chat box or the Q&A button. There is simultaneous interpretation. There's a little globus down below by the share button, and you can choose English or Russian. Also, in YouTube, you can watch it in both languages, Russian and English. For any tech issues, just write it in the chat box and our tech team will support you and try to help you out. Anyway, thank you very much. Again, Mr. Young, welcome. Mr. Young is the Deputy Mission Director of the USAID Central Asia Mission. He will have an opening speech for us. Thank you again, please.
All right, thank you, Philip, and good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this roundtable with the Economist Intelligence Unit, part of Day 3 of the Central Asia Trade Forum. As Philip said, I'm Peter Young, Deputy Mission Director for USAID's Regional Central Asia Mission, and it's really a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this important discussion. We have some really terrific speakers today, so I will just set the stage with a couple of brief comments and then get out of the way. So the COVID-19 pandemic has been a uniquely devastating shock for the entire world, with impacts far beyond public health. The global economy is expected to contract by some 5% this year. It's unlikely to recover to the pre-crisis levels until 2022. During this global challenge, the United States, through USAID, through the Centers for Disease Control and other government agencies, has been at the forefront of providing assistance to the Central Asia region from day one. Today's roundtable will include discussions on the actions that governments have taken and can take to help their economies recover from this year's economic shock. As an immediate response to the pandemic, USAID and the Economist Intelligence Unit Group have jointly released a comprehensive report on economic policy options for COVID-19 and beyond in Central Asia. The analysis shows that Central Asian economies have been hit hard by the pandemic and have faced some significant and unique challenges. But it also finds that there are a number of opportunities that the governments can pursue to support long-term growth and diversification of local economies. The report presents a set of economic measures for long-term recovery and international best practices for sectors such as tourism, light manufacturing, food processing, and others. The report also highlights the need for regional governments to avoid imposing protectionist restrictions and instead focus on a number of measures. These measures include improved regional cooperation and integration, also focusing on building public trust in government to ensure safe and secure management of any future outbreaks, also focusing on directing state support to high growth areas. And finally, encouraging the digitalization of public and private enterprises, which would lower costs for businesses and make the economy more resilient to future shocks. We believe that this moment of great challenge presents a vital opportunity to not only chart a path to recovery from the impacts of COVID, but also to increase cooperation within Central Asia, to diversify economic productivity, to strengthen economic opportunity, and to lead to even greater long-term economic resilience and sustainable growth for the region. This conversation tonight is an important step towards seizing that moment, and I wish you all a productive discussion and look forward to productive conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for setting the stage, and of course, a little background on USAID's work in Central Asia, which is very important to the development of the region. Now, to go directly to our experts, we have two experts from the Europe for the Economist Intelligence Unit. We have Chris, who is right now in Tokyo, and we have Matas, who is right now in London. Chris is with the Trade and Globalization Unit. He's the global lead. And Matas is with the Public Policy Unit, and he's leading our cooperation with our FGI project. So please, colleagues, go ahead, and then we will ask them questions. Please write your questions in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll continue the discussion after their short presentation. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Philip and Mr. Young, for the very kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to you and presenting the research that we have done as the Economist Intelligence Unit. I'll share my screen for a brief presentation. Okay, so as we know, and as Mr. Young very clearly outlined, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a truly unprecedented global shock. And the outbreak has really caught even the most advanced and sophisticated economies unprepared. Most governments around the world have been engaged in persistent experimentation, designing and continuously updating stimulus packages and intervention of unprecedented scale and scope. And we at the EIU developed this report, this analysis, to shed some light on the economic impacts that the pandemic is having in Central Asia, but importantly on the sort of policy options that regional governments have in terms of responding to it, both in short term and in long term. So as we know, the sort of ongoing spread of the virus has weakened the economic outlook for every region around the world. But it has done so to different magnitudes and through very different channels. So the global economic outlook for 2020 has worsened dramatically across the board. And we now expect China to be the only major economy to expand this year, but only just under 12% growth. The US and Russia are expected to contract around 4 to 5%, while the countries in Western Europe, especially UK, Italy, France, are expected to have a contraction of around 10%. Despite a high level of uncertainty about the virus spread and the vaccine development, we are not expecting the economy to recover to the pre-crisis levels before 2 years' time, so in 2022. And in terms of the cases, initially, countries in Central Asia have registered relatively few, especially because of relatively low population densities and somewhat limited integration in the global economic system. Mortality rates have also remained in the region relatively low compared to global averages. In terms of the responses, initially the governments in the region imposed temporary restrictions on businesses and movement of people to sort of varying degrees of intensity and speed between March and May earlier this year. However, as the result of rising cases and the second wave of the virus, governments have been forced to really extend or reintroduce these restrictions on either national or at least regional level. Overall, the policy responses in the region have reflected the fact that the nature of the economic shock is different to many advanced economies, and the fact that the region and the economies face very specific set of challenges. So firstly, the pandemic really exposed the low levels of diversification and high commodity dependence in the region. Regional economies are relatively open and depend on a non-diversified portfolio of both export markets and export products. This leaves them highly exposed to internal shocks, especially in terms of the foreign demand and global price fluctuations. So the ratio of trade turnover to GDP in the region averages at above 65%, and at least 60% of countries' export earnings come from commodities, particularly oil, gas, metals, and cotton. Moreover, the exports are concentrated in a few key markets, particularly obviously China, Russia, and Western Europe, whose economies have been hit very, very hard by the pandemic. In terms of secondly, the pandemic really highlighted a unique vulnerability of the region that comes from dependency on inflow of remittances. Alongside trade flows, the pandemic and countries' responses have interrupted cross-border movement of laborers, who are a key source of income in many countries in the region. So remittances account for some 15% of Uzbekistan's GDP and up to a third of Tajikistan's and Kyrgyzstan's. Significant losses of remittances due to layoffs in Russia, declining wages, and the border closures will also significantly worsen the current account deficit in these countries that are so dependent on them. Thirdly, the pandemic has really narrowed an already tight fiscal space in the region, limiting governments' ability to finance the response. Governments in the region already operate with fiscal restraints as a result of the reliance on commodity exports, underdeveloped financial markets, and weak institutional governance. Naturally, the governments increase their budget deficits to finance emergency support measures and the economic stimulus plans. But given the high level of debt and high risk premiums that countries face in the market, a lot of the macroeconomic response was focused on stabilizing currencies and even price controls on essential items. However, we do see and do expect that the deficit and debt burdens are set to increase this year and next year, and potentially creating or further narrowing the fiscal space for the governments. Overall, we expect that the crisis will have significant negative impacts on the regional economies. We expect that the real GDP in all countries in the region will decline this year. However, obviously this forecast will be updated depending on the developments in the key global markets as things change rapidly from week to week. But the underlying trends that we expect, that especially Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan will suffer from weaker demand for energy and other commodity exports, while Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan will particularly suffering, as I mentioned, from the fall of remittances inflows. But nevertheless, as any crisis in the world, the pandemic offers also some opportunities to develop more resilient economies. In the report, we outline a few, but I will run through some of the very key ones in terms of the short-term and long-term responses available to the governments. So in terms of the short term, we have really seen that avoiding complete lockdowns is an essential tool for keeping economies open. And this is particularly important for countries operating in the limited fiscal space that I talked about. This can be done by deploying monitoring tools such as mobile phone and social media tracking to really identify, monitor, and control local outbreaks. Some examples in the region already exist, but they really need to be expanded, made more robust, and importantly, more transparent and secure. The transparency and security of the data collection and data usage is absolutely essential to make the system work efficiently and safely in the long run. So countries in East Asia, particularly such as South Korea or Taiwan, offer some of the world's best practices on large-scale and secure data collection. So for instance, in South Korea, following the first case of confirmed COVID, health authorities began conducting surveys and collect large amounts of data using mobile phone movements and credit card transactions. But importantly, the data has been kept very safe through really strict compliant requirements on entities that collect and use the data, especially the personal information. Secondly, in the short term, it is really essential to provide support to people outside of the formal economy. So by supporting informal economy, governments can also increase trust in the state, enhance formalization, and help collect data on the informal workers, which obviously is essential in the long run. For example, we have seen that Morocco expanded its unemployment scheme to support people working in the informal sector. So the household benefits, the households that participate in a non-contributory health insurance receive a mobile payment depending on the household composition. And households that don't benefit from the health insurance scheme are able to claim cash support by registering online. And the program has been rolled out really successfully, really quickly, and managed to cover the majority of eligible households involved in the informal economy in the first months of its existence. And in terms of the long-term priorities, improving regional cooperation and integration is absolutely essential in the region. The pandemic has really highlighted the dependence of all countries in the region on international trade. Deepening of the regional trade cooperation can speed up the recovery and contribute to the necessary market diversification in the longer term. So any emergency barriers and restrictions on the movement of goods and services that have been imposed should be really removed as quickly as feasible. And in the region, we have seen that, for example, the ongoing C5+1 cooperation talks are a good example of how countries can engage in intra-regional and global cooperation to really address some of the most pressing challenges that they face. The government should really deepen similar existing dialogues and explore potential for new relationships, particularly with countries that are strong performing in this pandemic and that have innovative economies and innovative solutions in this downturn. So, for instance, we have seen New Zealand alongside 10 other countries really explicitly and strongly committing to continue trading with no interruptions, removing any restrictive measures on trade in essential goods, but also protecting supply chains and keeping the air and seaport open. Secondly, in long-term, digitalization of public and private sector activities is a really key factor of resilience. So digital economy obviously holds significant potential in terms of facilitating the necessary economic diversification in the region. However, Central Asia really remains one of the least digitally connected regions in the world. And so beyond sort of the needed development of necessary infrastructure, government should be really supporting businesses' digital awareness, their online development, their online presence, and as well providing or supporting access to digital solutions for SMEs in particular. So a good example of this practice is Japan's support for SME digitalization. The government offers a comprehensive support and subsidy to SMEs to introduce teleworking during the pandemic, which allows for business continuation during the disruption, whether it's this one, but also the future one. And finally, the government really should be focusing on providing support for areas with high growth potential. Obviously, the existing stimulus packages have focused on maintaining access to credit for firms and boosting social safety nets for the most vulnerable parts of the population. However, in the long term, countries do need to address the exposed structural vulnerabilities and facilitate diversification into high growth sectors. For the region, these are particularly ICT, renewables, agriculture, textile, petrochemicals, and others. So for example, we have seen South Korea introducing a New Deal investment plan to help reshape the economy in the aftermath of the pandemic. This long-term plan really aims to create up to 500,000 jobs by 2022 and really promote the use of advanced technologies such as 5G networks, AI and IoT technologies across the industries, and also fostering digitalization in the country's least developed areas. So overall, it is essential that the governments in the region, the governments and the businesses continue addressing the underlying structural vulnerabilities that have been exposed by the pandemic. It's important that they are able, post-pandemic, to participate and really compete in the challenging global trade and investment environment that Chris will tell us much more about. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Matus. Chris, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Philip and Peter for their introductions, and Mattis for his presentation. Mattis, I think you can go to the next slide. What I'm going to talk about just briefly here in 15 to 20 minutes is global trade, the EIU's outlook for global trade, the House view on some trade issues, and sort of some of my own personal views on the trends that we should be looking at in the years to come. And obviously, don't need to talk too much about what COVID has done right now, but I did want to backtrack a little bit as a way of introduction and note that while global trade didn't grow in the decade between the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 and the COVID-19 crisis, it didn't grow as much as it had in the preceding decade. It still grew. I think over the last 10 years, there has been a lot of hand-wringing about the state of globalization. Now, there's a dispute as to how much it actually grew and what metrics you use for measuring that growth. I think one argument against the fact that it grew in any meaningful way is that if you look from 2010 to 2018, 2019, trade as a percentage of global GDP was more or less stagnant. It didn't grow very much. Now, that it grew at all was actually encouraging for exporters. It wasn't as bad as it was made out to be. It wasn't as much as it could be, but I don't think it was bad as often portrayed. The other point I would make here is that after the recovery in trade, such as it was after the global financial crisis, did not set global trade back on a trajectory that it was on before the global financial crisis. So if you look at this chart to the left, and you look at January 2000 to sort of April, May 2008, you see a very clear trend line pointing strongly upwards. And while the post global financial crisis recovery, that trend line is still moving upwards until we have the massive drop off as a result of the global financial crisis. The trajectory was obviously not anywhere near the same. I guess the point I would make about the differences in those trajectories is that the era of hyperglobalization is never coming back. So that period, say between the the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the recovery up until the global financial crisis, trade was unlikely, especially in merchandise, trade in goods, physical goods. We're unlikely to see that sort of growth ever again. Now, our current forecast for trade in 2020 is for a 10.6% drop overall, or slightly less than the drop caused by the global financial crisis. That puts us as slightly more pessimistic than the more recent WTO forecast, which is for a decline of 9.2%. Now, this isn't optimistic by any means, but if you go back to June or July when the WTO and other organizations were releasing revised trade forecasts, this ranged from anywhere to -13 to -32 or 33% for the year. So things could have been much worse. And actually, it must be noted that they could have been much worse if China hadn't recovered as quickly as it has. There are other factors involved, fiscal stimulus contributing to consumer spending, but really the recovery in China has helped global trade out considerably. And we'll talk about China at a couple of different points over the next 15 minutes or so. Now, looking slightly further ahead to 2021, we forecast trade to grow 7%. And this is more or less in line with what the WTO is forecasting. The recovery in trade is probably going to take longer than the recovery in global GDP, which means that we're probably going to be a step down on trajectories again, where we see growth, but it's lower growth than we had experienced in the past. Next slide, Metis. Now, the key risks to trade, this, if you want to call it cautious optimism that we have about 2021 and beyond. The key risks, the first one is escalating US-China trade forces. Forces are split in the global economy. Now, I know that there, at least in the trade community, there's some excitement about a new Biden administration, but it's probably worth expecting a change in tactics rather than a change in strategy. You should expect some continuity in strategy, by which we mean working with allies, which is a change in tactics, to counter Chinese influence. And that's more or less a direct quote from one of President-elect Biden's recent speeches. There are some really irreconcilable differences between the two. I think the biggest one is technology, and we'll come back to that later on. Essential goods, that threat I think has lessened a little bit over the last couple of months, but it still remains as a threat and as one of our key risks. The second risk we have in our forecast is open economies permanently reverting to anti-globalist policies. I think this looks somewhat less likely than it did 3 to 4 years ago when the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump seemed to presage a new era in populism. I don't think that's unfolded as much as some of the forecasters predicted at the time. Populism obviously still exists, and there have been rises in tariff and non-tariff barriers, as Mattis pointed out in recent years. But I don't see it. I find it hard to see that populism is going to cause a reversion to massive anti-globalist policies in the coming years. Nevertheless, it's important to note that some export bans and strategic stockpiling amidst the pandemic, not encouraging policy moves from a number of countries. And then the third one is supply chain disruptions, which in the early days of the crisis, if you look back to February, March, April, May, there were definitely disruptions, and there was a lot of concern over what this would do on the supply side. But I think it could be argued, and it has to a lot of experts that I've talked to, that global supply chains have actually held up quite well. I've spoken to people in Asia and Europe and Latin America and the US. And while, for example, and in Japan, where I'm based, while, for example, there was concern about the supply of toilet paper and other essential goods in the early days, the supply chains eventually righted themselves, and there aren't as many disruptions or concerns about consumers being able to buy essential products as there were 6 or 7 months ago. So I think if we were to highlight one of these three risks as being the strongest or the most concerning, is the escalation of US-China trade tensions. Mattis, next slide. So going beyond the risks, I think there are definitely some encouraging developments that have occurred over the last couple of weeks. And one development that is still in the process of being completed. The first development is finally the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership has been completed and signed. Now, for those of you who don't know what this is a trade agreement between the 10 ASEAN members and 5 other countries, which are listed here: China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. India was a member of this agreement, but backed out towards the end of the negotiating process. Still, these 15 countries account for roughly 30% of global trade and roughly, depending how you do the calculations, 30% of global GDP. Now, while it's a positive development, there isn't a significant amount of trade liberalization. And the reason for that is most of these countries already have a crisscrossing, what's often called a noodle bowl in Asia, or a spaghetti bowl, if you prefer, of existing FTAs. Now, what this does, why the RCEP is an important agreement, is it harmonizes rules between the members. So it takes all these disparate bilateral and regional FTAs and it organizes them under a single umbrella. Now, while I do think this is a positive or encouraging development, we shouldn't expect to see a major spike in trade between members as soon as the agreement enters into force. Generally, FTAs take some time to funnel through to actual trade flows, but nevertheless, it's an important development. Now, the second one is, while I noted that there'll be a change in tactics, less so strategy regards China and a Biden administration, what we'll get out of the US, which is one of the leading economic powers in the world and does a lot to drive global trade policy, is more transparent policymaking, i.e. not trade policy making by tweet. So this injects some sorely needed, or this will inject some sorely needed transparency and predictability into the policymaking process. So that should be beneficial around the margins. I don't think we'll see a massive uplift in trade as a result, but it's certainly important. The next question is whether the Biden administration will roll back the tariffs that the Trump administration has implemented. It's still unclear whether that's going to be the case. It's likely some, many, but not all will be rolled back. And a return to multilateralism, or at least not undermining allies. So this means more will be invested in reforming and reviving the World Trade Organization. There are legitimate criticisms of the WTO, of the dispute settlement process, and those need to be worked through because the World Trade Organization, as one of my friends and colleagues like to say, is like air. You don't miss it until it's gone. So while the WTO is not really, hasn't really been for more than a decade, a substantial forum for advancing trade liberalization, it's still a vitally important forum. And then lastly here, we'll be getting a new Director General of the WTO. And it's highly likely, if not certain, that the next Director General will be a woman, either a woman from Nigeria or one from South Korea. And there's always the possibility when you get a new Director General that it will inject some life into some otherwise moribund processes. And I've had the pleasure of interviewing Mrs. Okonjo, and she has some interesting approaches to this. So there's reason to be optimistic, again, cautiously optimistic about the WTO regaining some ground that it's lost over the last couple of years. Mattis, next slide. Okay, so the global trade outlook, and I understand this is a trade event focused on export opportunities for the region, the Central Asia region. So what I have done here is just put together our forecast for imports over the next 4 to 5 years. Imports being potential markets for exporters from Central Asia. Now, this only covers goods. I'll talk about services in a moment. But as you can see, the EU 28 will be the largest potential export market, followed by Asia ex-China, the US, and China, and finally Russia. What you see here is that the percentage of global imports will mostly hold steady amongst these regions over the next 4 to 5 years. And importantly, Russia will not be growing at any substantial rate. So while I understand that Russia is an important market for exporters in Central Asia, it's certainly not something worth pinning your hopes on, because we don't see much growth in imports in that country over the next 4 to 5 years. Mattis, next slide. Okay, so just to wrap this up before we get to the Q&A, I mentioned trade and services. Now, this is this is the fastest growing part of global trade. A lot of focus up until the last couple of years has been on trade and goods. But if you look at the data, trade and services is growing faster and has been growing faster. And we say trade and services, tourism has already been mentioned, financial services, construction infrastructure services. There's a whole variety of services that have been growing substantially over the last decade. The risk here, or the problem, or something that needs to be thought about, and this can go back to the China-US split or dispute, but it's larger than that, is for trade and services to continue to grow, cross-border data flows need to be open and free to the extent possible. But they're clearly under threat right now, whether it's part of the US-China conflict. The US and Europe don't necessarily agree on a lot of the policy measures in this area. So actually, one of the biggest challenges for the new director of the WTO is to try to get something done in this area so that trade is helped rather than hurt. The next trend to watch or think about is supply chain reconfigurations. Now, at least, especially in Asia, which has some of the densest supply chains in the world, this has been discussed for years. And what sparked it initially was rising labor costs in China, which it was assumed would push a lot of manufacturers out into the rest of the region. But really, up until the last couple of years, and maybe even up until today, the supporting evidence for that was really anecdotal. You'd see stories about 3 or 4 new companies shifting supply from China to Vietnam, but it didn't support something as a massive trend. And that is, and one of the reasons we haven't seen it is because supply chains are much stickier than people appreciate. And what do I mean by sticky? There are a lot of costs that are involved in setting up and establishing supply chains the way that they're structured today. That's not only investing in plant and equipment, but investing in education and the people who work in your factories, education, investing in relationships with governments. There's a whole variety of investments that have already been made that are really difficult for companies to abandon unless the evidence is compelling enough for them to do so. Now, the question with the pandemic is whether there would be a COVID push. If this is going to finally push companies to reconfigure their supply chains, whether it's because of labor costs, because of trade disputes, trade issues, because of its supply constraints, it's very possible this might happen over the next couple of years, although I would be skeptical it would happen on a massive scale. You still see a lot of companies that are not leaving China. And I can answer questions about that if there are any in the Q&A. And then finally, the Belt and Road Initiative. So far, I think proponents of this have been disappointed, to say the least in some instances, and the skeptics have been proven right, maybe often for the wrong reasons. A lot of the investment in the quality and reach of infrastructure that were envisioned when it was called One Belt, One Road have not really materialized. And why is this? I think there was a lot of attention paid to the Chinese system of governance and the bureaucracy as all moving in one direction on this, and that hasn't been the case. And then the other issue, I think, is on the recipient side of investment. There's been an increasing amount of wariness about China's ultimate motives here. Now, we don't need to talk about debt diplomacy or things of that nature, but there are definitely a variety of concerns about China's motivations for carrying out this policy. So, combination of all of those factors, you have to ask, is Beijing losing interest? Is COVID going to be the starting point or one of the main sort of fulcrums where this policy or this initiative starts to fade away? And that could very well be the case. Now, the need for infrastructure around the world remains incredibly strong. And I think that's already been mentioned by the speakers preceding me. So it's time to think about what are the options. How can that infrastructure be built? How can it be financed? How can you ensure it's clean and green and reaches the areas it needs to, among other things, support more economies integrating into the global trading system? So I'll stop there, and Mattis and I will take any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Chris and Matus. Yep, we have several questions. Let me start with the first one. What are the specific sectors or areas that countries in Central Asia should pay special attention to in terms of diversification and long-term growth? You mentioned some, but please, if you can answer that one as well.
Yes, I'll jump on that one. Yeah, I think that's obviously a key question in terms of the sort of areas that have high potential in this environment in terms of global demand, but also in terms of the sort of capacities and capabilities available in the region. So we have looked at a number of potential sectors in the region. One of the sort of obvious ones has been a sort of agriculture and food processing, where Central Asia, the region overall, has a really high potential to trade far more and produce and export far more food and finished food products, both intra and inter-regionally, than it currently does. Mostly because of the sort of available land, existing capabilities, and labor costs. And we have also seen that global prices for agriculture products have been hit far less by the disruptions of the coronavirus compared to other commodities and other previous global recessions. So this is definitely an area to support. Really, what we have seen that there are numerous requirements, especially including infrastructure development and sort of logistics, storage, and processing, especially in the in the pandemic or in the type of disruptions that we have seen with COVID. Second area that second sector that we looked at, and obviously is sort of globally interesting, is the IT sector, and we have seen that that's one of the sector globally that has been particularly robust and resilient across the during the pandemic, understandably because due to the sort of cross-sectoral use of digital technologies and the demand for digital technologies across businesses, across regions, to ensure the business continuity and the continuity of business operations and activities. So obviously, in terms of the region, there is a sort of availability of relatively high skilled labor, low barriers to and close connections and low barriers to existing players in the sector, especially Russia with relatively strong capabilities in this sector. But as I said, the region is struggling with a low level of connectivity at the moment. So much greater investment and development of the infrastructure capacities, the underlying capacities, especially in some of the regions, is really necessary. And thirdly, I'll just mention the sector of renewable energy, which obviously is an area sector that has high growth potential globally and regionally. And I think that the region can really utilize the fact that it is close to both sort of geographically, but also in terms of existing linkages close to the Chinese market and European markets, where the strong renewable supply chains or production capabilities are. So integrated or taking part in these supply chains offers a potential area for growth, especially when we see that the policy responses around the world more and more include heavy reliance or heavy support for the investment and development of renewable energy projects. So whether it's Western Europe, but also increasingly in East Asia, and we'll see in the US, but definitely there is much more impetus for investment in renewables around the world. And I would just mention as a final sort of very cross-sectoral, but very, very important area, not really a sector, but the area of human capital. We have seen that investment or that generally human capital development in terms of education and training provision has been hit very hard by the pandemic. And in Central Asia, it's one of the areas that has been really undermined and really suffering. And already before the pandemic has been one of the factors undermining the competitiveness of local industries. And this is something that a lot of the countries around the world have now really are prioritizing to ensure that the provision of education, of training, despite the sort of obvious challenges sort of facing in pandemic, that this is at the heart of the policy response. And whether it's in terms of using the digital offering or using more multimedia offering in terms of provision of the services, it's absolutely essential that this is at the sort of very center of attention.
Thank you. Yeah, in my short period in the region, the IT kind of whole ecosystem, from the startups, young entrepreneurs, women in tech, to the e-commerce and all this cross-cutting issues, I think there's a huge potential, and there's in all the countries in Central Asia. So absolutely, I think that's a huge opportunity. Let me go to something a bit different. How can donors like USAID and other international partners support the region in this economic recovery And a second question is, if a vaccine can be widely distributed in 2021, can we expect a rapid return to the pre-COVID economy? You touched upon this, but maybe just expand a bit on the second one, and of course the first one we didn't ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that, the second one, I think that our current forecasts basically assume that are based around the assumption that the distribution of the vaccine will be towards the end of the next year. Obviously, we have seen the news, the recent news about the two very successful and very promising trials look very, very positive. Again, we will need more time and more data to see, to what extent the sort of success rates are really holding up, and we will see how long it will take really to sort of be able to produce and then mass distribute them, especially with the sort of challenges in terms of the cooling and in terms of the logistics that is necessary for a mass distribution around the world. So I think that there is definitely a sort of room for slightly improving that forecast, and it would have, of course, a significant impact if we change our assumption or improve our assumption of earlier, easier distribution. But it's still, there is still a question mark around that, and we will need to see and have more data on that.
I doubt it. It will be there in 2022, maybe a bit later. What about USAID support, international organizations like that? How can they support the process of economic recovery? What do you think?
Yes, so I would say that absolutely we have seen that, and across the board and across the countries in the region, that the international donor assistance is absolutely essential. And especially in what, as we have described, the sort of fiscal limits and restrictions that the countries in the region face. In terms of the sort of first response, the availability of funding from international community is absolutely essential to even allow for the most necessary responses. So when we were talking about the sort of monitoring and the sort of developing of the track and trace systems and things like that. But also I think it's really important to, keep inside the key sort of long-term areas, or like areas for long-term development that we mentioned, that it's really, really essential to support the development of those sort of that human capital, those capacities, and the development of capabilities in the sort of high growth and high potential sectors. Secondly, I would say that bringing in that those requirements that are really important for any of these interventions to really be efficient and really successful in the long term, especially around the transparency, protection of personal data, personal information. I think those sort of standards really, really need to be at the center of those interventions. And I think that the donor community obviously is very well placed to sort of promote these critical, standards and approaches.
Thank you. There's something specific, a question for Chris, and I think a second one that should be for Chris. So I'll ask both of them to you. First one is there room for a Central Asia Free Trade Agreement? And the second one is, I'll read the whole thing. Very interesting presentation. Any signs of lifting sanctions in 2021 from Russia, Iran, which can contribute to increase in global trade?
Right. Very good questions. Just one thing to add. I unmuted myself to add something to that Mattis was saying that's brought up here is the importance of education. And the reason it's important, especially when it comes to trade, is that I think in the coming years, the traditional development path that trade has provided with the ability of companies to move up the value chain, right? From agriculture to low value added manufacturing to sort of mid value and high value, that is no longer going to be in a viable development path. Companies are going to have to skip steps in that process, right? They're going to have to jump from low value added manufacturing to high value added manufacturing. And really the only way, not the only way, but the main way that that's going to happen is through increased education. And I think that ties back to what USAID can do here. So just a brief comment on that. Is there a room for CAFTA? Well, I would say there's always a room for each free trade agreement if countries can put aside some political issues. Now, I don't know what those specific political issues are to a potential CAFTA, but it would make sense for the region to pool its resources, to pool its human capital, and to become, if it isn't just sort of a quasi-regional powerhouse, a free trade agreement could do that. Now, it wouldn't be on something like the scale of, say, the RCEP or the CPTPP or what used to be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but every little bit helps. And to bring down trade barriers in any way, which to be called a free trade agreement, it would have to do, would be beneficial for the region. So is there room for it? I don't know the politics. Should it be done? Probably. Signs of lifting sanctions against Iran and Russia. That's probably more for our geopolitics people at the Economist Intelligence Unit. I have been getting reports that the outgoing administration in the U.S. is trying to poison the well, so to speak, of those sanctions being lifted, especially on Iran. Only time will tell if that turns out to be the case. But even if the incoming administration in the U.S. wants to overturn those sanctions, and I think it's more likely that will happen with Iran than Russia, it's not going to happen on day one of a Biden presidency. It's something that's going to take a considerable amount of time.
I'm not a specialist, but probably not. Let me go to some other questions. What policies will best help businesses in the informal sector? You talked about Morocco a little bit. We've heard the mention of reduced taxes or moratorium, free tax collection, but these don't help informal businesses much. So you talked about the unemployment benefits, but anything else you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a sort of very, very tricky area that has been a problem for a long time in many countries, not just in the region. But I think that I think that approach of basically trying to use the fact that there is this sudden need and sudden huge pressure for people who are normally, engaging in informal economy to be formalized, or to be at least supported through these sort of emergency measures. I think trying to utilize that is obviously key, right? So of course, on one hand, you do want to, what's necessary is to sort of simplify all these processes, right? So just simplify the sort of registration processes, making it easier, for businesses to be formalized, to pay taxes, to be registered, et cetera, et cetera. But also, using this emergency as providing a carrot, right? So basically saying that if you go ahead with this is something that, if you go through this process, even though if it's cumbersome at the moment, there are some benefits for you down the line, right? So in terms of the support. So I think it's really that sort of using that momentum, but of course, in the sort of long-term structural change does require to ease the processes and making that process, and those incentives much clearer for the businesses.
Thanks. Next one. can you name the biggest sustainability challenges related to current and potential sectors with high trade export potential? Would it be the environment, decent working conditions? Thanks.
Yes, so I think obviously there are significant challenges. So obviously we have seen that, you know, in the region, the sort of labor conditions are have been a concern in certain sectors, in certain areas, in certain countries. There has been progress, definitely. We have seen that there is a sort of the positive momentum. I would still say that it does come up at the sort of among the concerns, among the sort of sustainability issues that are raised. But definitely, I would say that in the sort of more long-term environmental aspects are very, very critical in the region. I would say that, you know, particularly what comes to mind is obviously the sort of water and energy nexus in the region that I believe needs to be addressed, needs to be reformed in order to sort of incentivize and really sort of provide the system that values the resources, especially, you know, especially water and energy, that are valued and they are priced, you know, properly. I know it requires a lot. It's a big ask, but I would definitely say that in terms of sustainability, those environmental pressures, they are, you know, growing. They are already in place. But you know, when we look at the projections of water availability in the region, and the water stress levels in the regions are intense. So I would definitely say that that is one area that really deserves a lot of attention.
Thanks. Let me see. Which country reviewed in the EIU report has most effectively implemented pandemic response measures from your point of view?
That's a good question. I mean, there are no, you know, it's always a little bit relative. There are no sort of.
Oh, just pick a winner. Don't be scared. Go ahead.
No magic, you know, tricks here. But I would say that definitely those that we studied in detail, we have seen that South Korea has been really good in terms of the very quick response and very strong control of the outbreak. So South Korea definitely, you know, managed to limit the outbreak.
It's protection of data and security and all that stuff. So
exactly. Other than that, I would say that in terms of the stimulus packages, we have seen actually quite large and comprehensive sort of stimulus packages in Canada, in Germany, also actually in the US. The first stimulus package has been quite comprehensive and quite broad, quite large in terms of the size. The downturn in the US obviously is the follow-up and the political barriers there. So I think that the first stimulus package has been quite successful, but obviously the second one that is needed is just not coming. So yeah, I would say those countries in terms of the stimulus packages, but in terms of the initial control, South Korea, Japan was really good in the first wave, and obviously Taiwan, but we haven't studied in more detail.
Yeah, I was going to say, Chris is in Japan and you're going to not say Japan. I mean, that's not nice. Next one. How far into debt countries should go in order to provide fiscal stimulus?
Yeah, so obviously, I mean, this is the big question that, you know, the whole international institutions are trying to answer. Obviously, there is not a sort of a single solution for countries here. I would say that it is absolutely, it is necessary, sort of like the initial, stimulus packages that we have seen across the region, even though they are creating the pressure on debt and obviously the sort of fiscal balance of the governments, have been absolutely necessary. I wouldn't sort of disagree with that. But there is a sort of warnings. There are warning signs sort of coming up that I think that the governments really need to be careful about, and really thinking about when the sort of stimulus, and even if it's through the cost of debt, is implemented, that there is a huge sort of attention, that there is attention paid to both the sort of efficiency of that stimulus, right? So it is directed where it really should be directed. And secondly, really also thinking about the necessary reforms that are, and then the necessary steps that are key to sort of expanding the revenue side, right? So we know that as we discussed, the formalization of the economy is a big challenge, and the sort of system of tax revenues is a big challenge in the region. So I think it's important that that revenue side is also recognized, because there is obviously the pressure is mounting on the countries in the region in terms of
as usual, a balanced approach. Let me see. Beyond the examples that you mentioned, are there any other countries that seem to be handling the pandemic well and can serve as an inspiration for policy interventions in the region?
Yeah, so I would say that in every sort of area there are a couple that sort of come to mind. Maybe I would say that so one of the countries that we haven't really studied in more detail, but is a really interesting sort of example is Taiwan. Obviously, in terms of the data collection, but also the data protection and the real sort of quick response. But one area that we have, for example, seen in terms of the sort of communication, and I wouldn't say that the country as such responded particularly well, but in terms of the education side, we have seen a couple of really promising programs in Mexico, for example, that is really using the sort of existing multimedia and digital platforms to keep or to continue with the sort of education and training processes in the country. So I think I would mention those. I think that generally beyond those that we have mentioned, that are the sort of really strong examples, in a lot of the countries we have seen that they tend to do small things particularly well, or specific things particularly well. So I think it's really about finding the really successful sort of examples of particular interventions.
Thanks. And the last question that I have globally, are there any sectors and countries where you expect a particularly strong recovery as of now?
Yeah, so I think that as sort of Chris mentioned, we have seen that, for example, China recovery has been much stronger than we initially expected. So that's definitely, and of course that has a sort of spillover effects across the world and across the trade. But I would say that in terms of the sort of global sectors, I would say that IT and ICT, we do forecast a sort of strong response in the global, sort of globally. And secondly, I would say that sort of generally pharmaceutical industry, but also healthcare as such, for understandable reasons, is set for a particularly strong rebound.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I don't think I have any more questions from anybody. Before I'll ask you some closing couple of words to say, I would like to say that the report is on the Central Asia Trade Forum website in Russian and English, as well as on our FGI Facebook site. Feel free to take it. Feel free to share it with your colleagues and friends, government institutions, private sector, please do. I appreciate everybody's time. Hold on. Thanks a lot. Very interesting. Thanks a lot from a participant. Thank you for me. Have your closing remarks, and then we'll close the roundtable. Chris, maybe you can start.
Well, thank you again for having me this evening. I guess any closing remarks I would want to make is, while things look grim right now, there is going to be recovery. As Mattis mentioned, there are, and as everyone knows by now, there are vaccines that are very encouraging and very promising. And global trade will eventually recover. It will take time. And even as that recovery is in process, there are going to be plenty of opportunities for exporters around the world and in Central Asia. So I don't think this is a hard time for everybody, but it doesn't diminish a lot of opportunities that are out there.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. Matos?
Yeah, again, thank you so much for this great event and the great discussion. I would sort of echo the cautious optimism from Chris's side that, of course, this has been a sort of extremely unprecedented and unique shock. As I try to outline, the region is in a particularly difficult situation given the nature of the shock. But I think that we have seen positive responses on the ground that are pointing to the right direction. So whether it's some of the sort of monitoring systems or it's support for the sort of specific areas of potential growth, but it's also the working together and sort of increasing cooperation both within the region, but also importantly with the donor community and with partners around the world. So I think that has been really, really sort of encouraging to see some of the responses. But I would say that it is really important that to think about that sort of post-pandemic world as well, right? We know, as Chris said, we know that we need to get through this, and of course the emergency measures are absolutely necessary. But there will be a world, there will be a life afterwards, and it's really important to really think about that when designing the strategies and the responses. And I will just repeat the absolutely key and essential aspects of education, human capital, infrastructure development, but also the sort of cooperative approach and integration really into the global trade and investment systems, and not focusing too much on just the sort of urgent or the isolationist and restrictive measures that perhaps were necessary in the short term.
Thanks, Maton. Just to close for myself, absolutely agree, and to build on this, regional cooperation is absolutely high on the list, and it's a must. I think also, like this report, please look at best practices and worst practices from the globally, learn from them, apply them, whether it's in the private sector or the government. It doesn't matter. We all learn and make mistakes. Let's not make mistakes that others do. Like you said, let's look beyond the COVID-19 and what we can do to prepare for ourselves for that in the sectors that we discussed and other ones that we all know about. So thank you very much, Chris and Matus. Mr. Young as well, thank you for participating. We hope everybody enjoyed it, and we'll see you some other time. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you very much. Bye.